We've come a long way in our objects understanding already, and now it's time to look at how we can understand whether a value exists or a property exists, and look at some sensible ways that we can detect and safety check whether each of them exists. Now, earlier on in the course, we looked at truthy and falsy values, so the same rules apply to when we want to check object property values. So let's dive in and just get these out of the way. Then we can look at how to check whether a property exists, which is a little bit more interesting. Now, what we want to do, you can see in the console, we have ID, name, and price, and we just want to check whether the value of one of those exists. So what we can do is do something such as ID, and you can save this out. Now you can see that in the console, we have the string of XHS and so forth. And when we want to check whether a value exists, so for instance, it might be that we are using a conditional. If the drink.id exists, then we want to go ahead and fulfill and do something. So that would be our use case to understanding whether something does exist or not. So what we'll do is move our console log inside this conditional just to make our example a little bit more real world. So what we'll do, we'll have our conditional here, and then we'll log out the value here, because what we're about to do is see whether it lets us through, and then if it does let us through, we want to see what the value in fact was. Now, earlier we learned that a conditional statement lets us through if this value evaluates to a truthy value. So at the moment we know that an ID has a value of a string, and that string has some details. Now if we go and remove the string, we're left with a completely empty ID. So when we save this, it shouldn't be unknown to us that we're not going to get anything. Now it may seem, if you're new to JavaScript, you're saying if drink.id, it almost looks like we're checking the property to see if it exists. So we're going to do 2-in-1 in this video and check whether the property exists and whether the value exists as well. Now, obviously, the safest way to check whether the value exists, you could go ahead and do something like this. You could say if the drink ID. Now, if we wanted to convert it to a Boolean explicitly, we could add a not in front of it. Now, we don't technically need to do that because this is letting us through, but understand that when we want to check if a value exists, it needs to be a truthy value if you want to go ahead and detect it. Now, there are also other ways that we can detect whether a value exists, such as when we're looping. Now, we'll get onto looping in objects later on in this chapter, but for now, we'll just introduce you because this video makes perfect sense. So what we're going to do is use a for in loop. Now, this is typically what we would use to iterate over an object. So here we're going to say for const, we're going to create a property variable for every item in the drink. Now, it doesn't mean exactly that. The in operator has some mystical powers, which we'll look at momentarily. But first, let's get this out of the way. So first, let's go ahead and say prop. We'll console log this out. And you can see here we are iterating over ID, name, and price. Now, to look up the value of this, we need to drink, square bracket, and then pass in that property. Remember earlier, we were looking at the square bracket syntax to dynamically look up a property name. So here we can save this out, and you can see that we have our ID, the name, and then the price object as well. Now, if we wanted to check whether a particular property inside this loop did exist, so this is just another real-world use case that we can look at. We can say if the drink property, and it might be that we are looking for a particular value, for instance. So we could say if the drink property value equals lemonade, then we know here that we are looking at the name of the drink. And it won't be any surprise that if we drink square bracket prop, this will log out just the word lemonade. So these are just some ways that we can access properties. We're demonstrating it in a loop, and here we're checking the value itself. So these are just some patterns that we can use to see whether a value does in fact exist on an object. And here, this could be driven from a dynamic variable, and we're simply making a comparison inside of this loop. Now, I also want to show you one more syntax, and this is a fairly new syntax. And we have object.values. Now what this will do is give us an array of all of the values on our drink object. Now if we console log this out, we can see something quite interesting. So you can see here that we have an array. So we have 0, 1, 2, it's an array. The first item is the value, second item is our name, and thirdly, we see the price. So this is a nice way to get all of those values from our object in one simple function call to object.values. Now, instead of doing something what looks very imperatively, where we're trying to spell things out for the computer, this is what is called a declarative method. So we're just telling the computer that we want to do something. Please give me all the object values, whereas here we're just iterating all of the object values. And the difference is we're calculating how to do it rather than just saying, do this for me. Now, interestingly, we have a new method on array, and we looked at this earlier when we had a string. We had a string includes. So here we can just simply say, if any of these values has lemonade inside, then we can go ahead and do something. So you can see here we have the value of true. And to clean things up, we could move this out into a variable. So we could say has lemonade, and above it we could say const has lemonade equals that object.values. So this is a nice pattern of how we can detect whether an object value does in fact exist. Now, when we're using Babel, this is a nice approach which we can use. If you want to check a specific value, that's probably the way to go. And it might be that this array is coming through dynamically, so we could in fact use this approach. To keep things simple, however, we could just go for a simple if drink.id as an example. So this is how we can check the value existence. But what about if we want to detect whether even a property exists or not? Now there's a few built-in ways. We're going to look at similar patterns to this. So we'll start off with a nice console log. Now, I talked about this in Word, so now it's time to actually talk about that a little bit further. Now, JavaScript objects in fact have a method, so a function on the object built into them, which will tell us whether or not it has a particular property. Now we have drink, so let's go ahead and do dot has own property, and then we can say, does it have the property name? So we'll save this out, and you can see here that we have true logged out in the console. So our drink object does have a property called name, and yes, of course it does. We have this name which we're used to up here. Now there is one big flaw with this approach. Can you see what it is? It might not be obvious at first, but we could actually go ahead on our object and actually create a method called hasOwnProperty, and we could go ahead and return false. Now you can see here when we save this, this now returns false, even though we have a property called name. Now it may seem like a silly idea, but this has definitely happened in the past, which is why we look for a slight variant and a different form to verify that it does indeed have its own property. So we'll save this and revert this back to true, so we have a nice clean ground to go from. So that's one way. Let's have a look at another way to verify the property existence. Now earlier on when we were type checking, we did something like object.prototype and we did a toString. Now instead of toString, because our object drink in fact inherits from the object prototype, it gets this method called hasOwnProperty. So even though we can override this hasOwnProperty over here, it isn't actually overwriting it on the object prototype, which means that we could access this function directly, and using our new knowledge we can call with the context of our drink and then pass in the argument of name. So we'll save this out, and again you'll see this is true. Now to verify that this is an absolute bulletproof way of checking whether an object does have a property, we can go back up to our commented out function, and you watch this middle one here. So we have true, true, true. This will be true, false, true. So we'll uncomment this, save it out, and you can see that even though we've added this hasOwnProperty, our safest way is accessing the object prototype directly, and then changing the context of the execution to actually look up our drink. So in fact, internally, this function is going to be doing, does my object in fact have a property called name? So we're mitigating any potential mistake by accessing this hasOwn property directly on the object. Nowadays, this tends to not be so much of an issue, but depending on libraries you potentially including in projects, this will always be the absolute safest way to go. This has happened in the past, and for the sake of being super safe, if we were to create a function, a wrapper function that just checks whether an object's property exists, it makes sense using this approach over this approach. Now, the last way that we're going to demonstrate is using not object.values, which we were looking at in the last video, but object.keys. We can then pass in our drink object, we'll hit save and just check this out in the console. So our ID, name, and price are now given to us as an array. And again, you may have guessed it, we're going to say, does it include the name property? So everything comes out as true, and we've successfully looked at whether or not something has a property. Now, depending on the size of our drink, we might have a huge object with lots of properties on and not just these 3 top-level properties that we have. Therefore, this object.keys may seem a bit overkill, but it's good to know that we can do this if there ever is a use case where you want to convert an object into an array and just get those keys. We can say, does it include my name? We know that this is the way to go, the safest way to go, but this is a perfectly valid use case, and it's absolutely fine to use this, but just be careful and keep it in mind.